You know what the internet needs right now? Yet another video complaining about Disney's most annoying trend at the moment, at least when it comes to their films. So you know what? Let's just talk about all of them. The good, the bad, mostly the bad. Okay, let's try to be fair. Some of these films actually aren't that bad. Heck, a few of them are actually quite good. And even some of the lesser ones might have a little bit more to admire than you might think. So I think it's time to look back and see what works and what doesn't when Disney remakes some of their own classic stories. Now, some of these films have already faded from my memory since I've only seen them once, and a couple I actually haven't seen yet at all. So what I decided to do this time around, compared to my Disney animated films reviewed video, link to that in the description below, is that I will be rewatching every single one of them, and I will be doing it in the order they originally came out. It'll be kind of interesting seeing the original Disney live-action remakes from way back when, and notice the evolution, or de-evolution as the case may be, of them as time passes. And let me say, there's some remakes that I'm really not looking forward to rewatching. But this is a self-inflicted challenge, so I guess I can only get so mad. A quick side note is that some of these reviews will contain minor to major spoilers, but honestly, if you've seen the original films, there's not really much to spoil. Anyway, there's your spoiler warning. And another quick note. Even though Peach Dragon is technically not a Disney live-action remake, since most of the original film is live-action already, I will be including it on this list, since it doesn't feel right leaving it off. It came out during the period when Disney was releasing a lot of live-action remakes, and it has the feel of a Disney live-action remake. I say it counts. If you feel like it shouldn't, then just discard it in my final ranking at the end of the video. Anyway, with all that said, let's dive into this, a review of every single Disney live-action remake to date. Yay. Most people tend to think of Maleficent, or maybe even Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, as the first Disney live-action remake. They're certainly the ones that started off the trend that's continued to this day. But, technically, the very first Disney live-action remake came out in 1994. So, that's where we will start. Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book is, by definition, the first Disney live-action remake of one of their animated films. Although, in my opinion, it would be more accurate to describe this as just another adaptation of the books, as the similarities between the two films, beyond character names, are actually very scant. But, I'm not here to argue technicalities, I'm here to review the film. So, how is the film proper? Well, the one thing that stood out to me most about this film was where it puts the focus. Unlike most adaptation of The Jungle Book, which puts the primary focus on Mowgli's time in the jungle as a kid, this film opts to focus on Mowgli as an adult. But what exactly does the film do with this? Not much. The feeling I get about Mowgli as a character, at least from my memories of reading the original book, is that he's not really supposed to be a member of the jungle, but he's also not really meant to be a part of civilization either. He's kind of lost in this middle ground where he really, truly doesn't belong anywhere, which makes for a very sad and tragic character. And you don't really get that sense in this film. The film seems to be portraying him as somebody who's more wild animal than man, and not someone who's neither man nor animal. In fact, his whole character arc is about him becoming Lord of the Jungle, and I just don't find that very interesting. But I'll tell you what is interesting. See if the plot of this film sounds familiar. A group of British researchers come across a man living in the wild away from any humans, and they use this opportunity to research the man and teach him English over the course of a musical montage, and in the process he falls in love with the young woman helping to teach him. And there's a big bad guy who wants to use the fact that there's a man who speaks both English and the language of the animals to look for some treasure. Sound familiar? Normally, I'd say this film was ripping off Tarzan, but no, this film actually predates Tarzan by a good 5 years. So, technically, Tarzan is the ripoff of the two films. Boy, Disney was so intent on remaking all of their animated films, they got a huge jump start on Tarzan. All joking aside, the plot of this film is a generic jungle adventure film. Kind of like George of the Jungle, only played straight, and using the name Jungle Book. Which I wouldn't mind so much if the film was entertaining or interesting, but it's not either. It's mostly just kind of bland. The jungle set looks just like any other jungle set. The animals don't really have much personality. Most of the characters are stock. Even the dialogue feels trite. No new ground is being covered here whatsoever, which left me scratching my head, wondering why this was even made. The film even seems uncertain who exactly the target audience is. There are moments that layer on the broad comedy, clearly aiming for little kids, at least I hope, like the animals making funny faces or silly noises or stuff like that. But other parts seem aimed at a bit of an older crowd, including containing more swearing than you might think, and even some pretty horrific scenes of violence for a film aimed at kids, including a character drowning in quicksand, another being buried alive, and another being eaten by a giant snake. So, okay, I've complained about this film a lot. What works about it? I guess the acting's not really that bad. It's nothing great, but it's not bad. Jason Scott Lee is actually a decent Mowgli. He nails the mannerisms of a man who grew up in the wild, and when he has to do an emotional scene at the end of the second act, he actually does it pretty good. The film has a strong cast, from Carrie Elways as the slimy villain, a pre-Game of Thrones Lena Headey as the love interest, and John Cleese as a very likable doctor who's genuinely interested in Mowgli both out of intrigue and later as a friend. The only one I'm not crazy about is Sam Neill. Something about him just feels kind of out of place, and I can't put my finger on it. It doesn't help that the character is underutilized to the point where twice I actually forgot he was even in the film. Some of the action's also alright. The camera for the most part stays still and keeps the action clear and easy to follow. Nothing great, but for a kid's film, it's not bad. I also really like that they used real trained animals for the most part, and I appreciate that they decided to make it so that the animals don't talk. It wasn't necessary for this rendition of the story, so it's nice that they showed some restraint. But overall, this film just doesn't work, no matter which way you look at it. It doesn't work as a good adaptation of the books, it doesn't work as a remake of the 1967 animated film, and it doesn't really work as its own thing. It's cliche, dull, and goofy, but not in a fun way. Which is a shame. I was hoping that maybe it would be one of those underrated gems hidden away inside the Disney catalog, but this isn't it. I'm going to give Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book a 5 out of 10. Also, is it me, or is it strange that this movie uses Kipling's name in the title, when this is basically an in-name only adaptation? 101 Dalmatians is, in my opinion, the first proper Disney live-action remake. Whereas The Jungle Book barely resembled its animated counterpart, this one follows the original a bit closer. The main difference between this and the original is that in the original the animals talk, and here they don't. And I'll admit, as a kid, I didn't like that they didn't talk. But now that I'm an adult, I am so glad that they don't. For one, I think it would have been really distracting, especially with the CG technology they had at the time. We just get to see the dogs and the puppies acting like dogs and puppies, and it's cute. And secondly, I think it helps this film stand apart enough from the original animated film. For the most part, this is a faithful rendition of the story, but it doesn't copy everything beat for beat the same. In short, it justifies its own existence. Part of the reason for that might be because this feels like a film that the people involved actually wanted to make. This feels like a film that Disney had to be persuaded by other filmmakers into making, not the other way around. And I'm not saying that's what happened, I'm just saying that's how it comes across to me. And yeah, it's impossible to talk about this film long without talking about what this film is most remembered for, and very rightfully so. Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil. Talk about ideal casting. And sure, if you thought the original film was too unsubtle, Glenn Close takes it to a whole new level. She's loud, she's insane, and she's absolutely wicked. She's just so over the top, so crazy, so clearly having the time of her life eating the scenery. She's just so entertaining to watch. And it's not just Glenn Close either. They got some really talented actors for this film. Jeff Daniels and Jolie Richardson as Roger and Anita have good chemistry. There's a pre-House Hugh Laurie and a pre-Harry Potter Mark Williams as Horace and Jasper. They're great together. And Joan Plowright as the nanny. These are all excellent replacements, and they slip into their roles comfortably. The thing I like about this film and the original film is that they do kind of exist in this universe that, yeah, feels very much like ours, but there's something about it that makes it its own. And I think it's the fact that in this universe, the humans take their dogs way more seriously than we do. I mean, in both versions, the fact that 15 puppies are stolen is front page news. There's even a really funny bit in this film where the pregnant Anita goes to the doctor for a checkup on the baby, and right next door a pregnant Perdita goes to the veterinarian for a checkup on the puppies while their respective significant others wait outside. I'm sorry, that's just funny to me. There's just something so amusing about a vet treating a pregnant dog as seriously as an actual pregnant woman, and without the owners present in the room. This kind of creates this nice, soft, laid back atmosphere that really puts you in a good mood. And you, of course, get to see the dogs be kind of creative and well trained, and the puppies being cute. I mean, yeah, if you like dogs, I think you're going to like this film. What's interesting to me about this film is that, much like The Jungle Book, this film is in some ways darker than the original film. I mean, this film literally shows Cruella fawning over the fur pelt of a Siberian white tiger that she illegally had skinned, and Skinner is a genuinely terrifying villain. There's also a bit more kid-friendly moments as well, namely the Home Alone-style slapstick antics in the film's second act, but I think it feels a little bit more balanced here. And since the matter has been brought up, let's discuss the elephant in the room, and probably the most divisive part of the entire film, the element that can either make or break it for some people. This film was written by John Hughes, and after writing Home Alone, he began including more kid-friendly slapstick moments in his films, and this film is no exception. Watching the second half of this film, you can definitely tell, like a lot of kids' films at the time, it was trying to emulate the feel of Home Alone's third act. And it does kind of feel out of place in contrast with the more down-to-earth first and second acts. It's actually kind of amusing. When I was a little kid, I liked the slapstick moments more in the first half, but as an adult, I'm more drawn to the character-driven first half than the slapsticky second half. And it's not that the slapstick's done bad for the most part, it's just that it lacks punch. A lot of abuse gets heaped upon Horace and Jasper in particular, but a lot of times it doesn't feel like the animals are actually doing anything to cause them pain or suffering. They're just kind of doing it on their own, slipping on the floors or making dumb decisions that wind up causing them pain and suffering, and that's not nearly as funny as having the animals be the cause of their misfortune. Like I said, it's not done badly, I just felt like if they were going to go this route, then it needed to be a lot funnier. And my other biggest complaint, and this is the one thing about the film that I genuinely don't like, and it's the brief moments where the puppies do things that would be too dangerous for real puppies to do practically, so they use a fully computer animated puppy model, and it looks terrible, and so obviously fake. I know there was really no way around it since they really couldn't have the puppies do those dangerous stunts, and they were limited by the technology of the time, but that still doesn't mean that it's a good effect, and not an issue with the film. But honestly, if that's my biggest gripe with the film, I'm not going to complain that much. I still like the characters. Glenn Close is, of course, amazing as Cruella. It's funny enough. It's got dogs and puppies who are very well trained in this film being cute and charming. And it's not like the film ends on a bad or sour note. Ultimately, this film is charming, funny, sweet, and entertaining. I'm not going to pretend that this is great cinema because it isn't. But every time I watch it, I just have a blast and it makes me feel good. I enjoyed it as a kid, and I still enjoy it as an adult. Like I said, just for different reasons. 101 Dalmatians gets an 8 out of 10. And honestly, if you had asked me to make a live-action remake of 101 Dalmatians, this is pretty close to what I would turn in. It maintains the same basic story of the original film, but is just different enough to justify its existence, which is not something I'll be able to say about certain future live-action remakes coming up. Next up on the list is 102 Dalmatians, the direct sequel to the 1996 remake. Again, I don't think this really counts as a, quote, Disney live-action remake, unquote. But if Alice Through the Looking Glass and Maleficent Mistress of Evil count, then I suppose this one does as well. I actually grew up with this film a lot more than the first as a kid. I probably watched this film, or rather certain parts of it, all the time. So I think it's fair to say that this film has a lot of nostalgic connection for me. But now, after finally rewatching this film as an adult, I have to ask, does this film hold up? Well, parts of it do. But as a final product, does it actually work? Not really. I have a lot to say about this film, so strap yourselves in. There's a lot to unpack, so let's go through this step by step. So, the premise of this film is that Cruella de Vil, after being arrested in the first film, spoiler alert, she winds up being rehabilitated and granted parole. How did they rehabilitate her? Hypnotherapy. No, really, it's like some kind of Clockwork Orange-style brainwashing where she goes from hating animals to loving animals. The film actually uses the phrase altering brainwaves to describe the process. That opens up some terrifying implications that I don't think the filmmakers intended, but as an adult, I can't unsee. But whatever, kids' fantasy, I'll look past it for the moment. So basically, this new and improved Cruella is on parole, and if she's rearrested or violates her parole, then her entire £8 million fortune will be relegated to a single destitute dog shelter. I am pretty sure a judge wouldn't have the authority to do that, but whatever. And it turns out that her probation officer just so happens to own one of the original 15 puppies, now all grown up, Dipstick. I guess Roger and Anita didn't want him anymore, or something. And coincidentally, he's recently sired 3 Dalmatian puppies, one of them a spotless Dalmatian named Oddball. And the probation officer, who doesn't think that Cruella can ever change, and the owner of the animal shelter, who does think Cruella has changed, begin to spark a romance when suddenly Cruella reverts back to her original personality. Once again, she wants to make another fur coat made from puppies, and as vengeance for Dipstick escaping her wrath the first time around, has something special in store for his 3 puppies. Okay, so that's the very basic setup, and as you can see, there are some issues. Aside from the whole brainwashing problem, the setup is a bit overly contrived. This movie had to take a lot of shortcuts and huge leaps in order to make a sequel to the original film even possible. For example, the original film showed Roger and Anita were very close to the dogs, and they clearly had a lot of room and space at the end of the film, but then suddenly in this film, they appeared to have given at least Dipstick away. And it's never explained what happened. Roger and Anita aren't even mentioned, not even indirectly, and this feels very out of character for them. But if the setup was overly convoluted, maybe the rest of the film will pick up the slack. So does it? Well, in some ways yes, and in some ways no. There are a lot of things about this film that don't make any sense. For instance, at one point the boyfriend Kevin gets arrested because the police think that he stole the Dalmatian puppies. But then as he's taken to jail, they put his dogs and Parrot in the cell with him. Because that's certainly how that works. And another thing about that scene, so the police confiscate the stolen puppies, and then Cruella distracts the chief of police by complimenting and sweet-talking him, while her valet, Alonzo, re-steals the confiscated puppies from the police car, and apparently the police never noticed this. When they got back to the station, or heck, even when they got back in the cruiser, they should have heard a distinct lack of puppies barking at the very least. It's just so stupid. Then there's how Cruella gets changed back into her old self. So, it turns out the hypnotherapy wears off when you hear Big Ben chime, which is a little weird, but I can accept. What I can't accept is that Cruella apparently went what seems like months living in or around London without ever hearing Big Ben chime even once. That's just... no. Also, I'm not sure I get what this film's message is. So okay, the film seems to be going for a message that some people deserve a second chance, but some people will never change. Kind of a confusing message for a film aimed at little children. I mean, the film clearly showcases that even in her brainwashed state, dogs still hate and fear her. Not just dogs that remember her like Dipstick, but all dogs. But part of the film talks about how people and dogs deserve a second chance, and the film seems to expect you to agree with them. I mean, Kevin's shelter is literally named the Second Chance Dog Shelter, so it's a clear and obvious motif. But it doesn't even really matter in Cruella's case anyway, because her change isn't a genuine change of heart, but was accomplished via brainwashing. So is the message supposed to be that people deserve a second chance unless they've been brainwashed into it? Again, that's kind of a confusing message, and these bigger problems distract from a bunch of tinier problems. Owen Grufford and Alice Evans, who actually ended up becoming a real-life couple after meeting on the set of this film, so congrats to them, play the 2 lead human characters, and the characters are pretty bland. They're likable enough, but they don't really leave much of an impression. The dialogue in this film is also pretty lackluster, which is a weird complaint to have, but the dialogue here just feels awkward. And the first act is mostly just a lot of setup that just isn't very interesting. Even as a little kid, I remember finding the first 30 minutes or so of this film to be pretty boring and was actually a little confusing. So this movie sounds awful, right? Well, let's look at the good stuff, because believe it or not, there are actually some good things in here. The thing that actually genuinely works about this film are the villains, and thankfully they get a lot of screen time. Again, Glenn Close, while not quite as threatening as she was in the first film, is still clearly having a blast yucking it up for the camera. And in this film, she also gets to bounce off an equally hammy Gerard Depardieu as her Fourier, and Tim McInerney, one of the only two returning actors from the original film, is also fun as the bumbling, incompetent valet who receives the brunt of most of the abuse and slapstick. I actually kind of like how in this film, when he gets injured, he actually shows signs of it later on, like wearing a cast or bandages. I gotta admit, that's actually pretty funny. I also really think the production and costume design, as well as the makeup work in this, is really good. The scene where Cruella sees spots everywhere is a great example of that. When you think of all the work that had to have been done, with all the makeup that had to be applied to all those extras, as well as painting all of the cars, and all for just a scene that lasts only 30 seconds. The film also makes use of special effects, and yeah, some of them are obviously fake when they have to CG an entire dog for a dangerous stunt. But subtler ones, like when they digitally remove the spots on the main puppy Oddball, which, just to get an idea of how much work went into this, they had to remove every single spot for every single frame that she was on screen. For the most part, it actually works okay. Eric Idle actually gets a few laughs as a macaw who thinks that he's a dog. And I will say, the one element that this film actually did better than the first film is the slapstick payoff at the end. The ending scene where the puppies bake Cruella de Vil into a giant cake is just so creative and so much fun to watch. Yeah, it's campy and cartoonish, but it's still a real treat to watch. Honestly, that 4-minute sequence makes the whole film for me. So for me, I'm really torn about this film. It's obviously deeply flawed, and it probably has more issues than not. For some, this film will have just enough charm to overshadow its obvious story flaws. It still has dogs and puppies being kind of cute. There are moments of genuine creativity. The film looks really nice, and the human characters, while not as well written as they are in the first film, aren't done that badly. They're just kind of bland. And like I mentioned before, the film has Glenn Close again having a ball playing Cruella de Vil, and Gerard Depardieu and Tim McInerney also make for fun sidekick villains. But if you want a film that's consistently competent and is genuinely well made, this isn't it. And if you don't like the first film, you're probably not going to like this one. And I also can't say how someone who didn't grow up with it would respond to it. I mean, this film, far more so than the first film, is aimed more at little kids. The first film, while still a kid's film, was also aiming for adults at times. This one doesn't have a lot that's aimed at adults. I don't know if this is my nostalgia talking, but I'm going to give this film a 6 out of 10. It's not great, and honestly, it's probably not even good. But this was a childhood favorite of mine, and I can't find it within myself to rate this lower, even though, to be frank, it probably should be. Not exactly a glowing recommendation, but take that for what it's worth. Alice in Wonderland, directed by Tim Burton. Now, here's a film that was a massive hit at the box office when it first came out. And honestly, I can kinda see why. There's a lot of things that you can say about this film, and trust me, I'll get to those in a minute. But the one thing that struck me about this film was its look. While sure, it doesn't look real, like in the sense of the 2019 Lion King, this film is actually quite stylistic and creative. I love the designs of all the Wonderland characters, especially the March Hare and the Cheshire Cat, and the backgrounds also look really creative and nice. Sure, it's aesthetically dark, but I actually didn't mind all that much. Wonderland is kinda supposed to be this off-putting place that doesn't always feel right. And Tim Burton does manage to capture that feel of a dark, quirky atmosphere, and I thought it worked here. And the film, for the most part, is well cast. I mean, okay, Johnny Depp is overutilized, but the film also contains Stephen Fry as the Cheshire Cat, Alan Rickman as the Smoking Caterpillar, Helena Bonham Carter as the Red Queen. These are all good picks. Unfortunately, that's where most of the positives end. This film has a lot of problems, and unfortunately, they're not nitpicks. Mia Wasikowska, the actress playing Alice, is pretty wooden. Not Brie Larson and Captain Marvel wooden, but still wooden. She has the look of what an adult Alice might look like, but oftentimes it doesn't feel like she's reacting to the strange events in Wonderland, which is understandable. For 90% of the movie, she's basically standing in front of a green screen reacting to something that isn't there. I mean, it can't be easy. It also doesn't help that the actress is basically given nothing to work with about half of her dialogue being her trying to convince herself that this is all just a dream, and that just gets tiring after a while. And like I said before, Johnny Depp feels off as the Mad Hatter. I can't explain it since this feels like it should be ideal casting, but something about it just didn't quite work for me. Maybe it's because Depp is taking this role too seriously, or maybe it's because the character is poorly written, or maybe a little bit of both. I'm honestly not sure, but for whatever reason, it just felt off. But by far the biggest problem with this film is kind of a biggie. The writing. This script is awful, and a lot of it centers around this plot about the Red Queen's reign of terror and an underground movement by the residents of Wonderland to overthrow her, and some kind of prophecy in which Alice is said to kill the Queen's beloved Jabberwock, erroneously called the Jabberwocky because researching that would have taken 30 seconds the writers clearly didn't have, and that's somehow going to restore the balance of power in Wonderland, and okay, let's discuss why that doesn't work. Wonderland is a place where logic and reason is completely turned on its head, which makes sense in the original books because Wonderland is unmistakably just a dream. But when you try to combine the insanity of Wonderland with the Chosen One storyline, not only does it feel completely out of place, but it opens up so many plot holes. For instance, why doesn't Alice just eat a bunch of Upokushin until she's a massive giant and just snatch the Red Queen away, or squish the Jabberwocky like a bug or something? And that's the problem. This film tries to inject some reason and logic into a world that actively defies it, and it doesn't work. And maybe it could be forgiven if the plot was really interesting or really engaging, but it's just kind of this generic cookie-cutter hero's journey. A prophecy must be fulfilled fantasy story with zero deviation. And that's not interesting. And I'm not saying you can't tell a story in which Wonderland is real, or heck, maybe if you really put some thought into it, maybe you could tell a more serious story in Wonderland. I don't know, maybe you could have even done this prophecy plot if the characters were treating this like it's some kind of game or something. You know, like the chess match in the second book. Or maybe if some residents are treating this like a giant game, but others are taking it deathly seriously. That could have been interesting and fun, and it would have kept the audience guessing all the way through. And you honestly wouldn't have even needed to change all that much. There's potential here. But this film takes everything way too seriously. It seems to think that it's telling some epic fantasy story like the Chronicles of Narnia or something, but it just falls flat. So yeah, there's a lot about this film that I really do like and enjoy. And there's also a lot that I really don't like, which is so strange. Usually I'm not this divided on a film, but I really am here. There's very little in here that's middling or middle of the road. Either something in this film is great, or it's awful. I was a little split about what rating I should give this film, but after some thought and after writing down my thoughts, I think this film deserves a 5 out of 10. Very close to a 6. While I do like the creativity and the designs and the look of the film a lot, I also can't ignore the fact that this film's script and story is awful. And I'm sorry, that's kind of the most important part of a film. I don't regret seeing it, but this is not a good film. It's all style and no substance. Alright, fine, we'll talk about you next. Maleficent, the live-action spin-off / retelling of Sleeping Beauty. Yeah, remember Wicked and how successful and great that show was? Well, that's basically what this is. It's Wicked, but done with Maleficent instead of the Wicked Witch of the West. But does this film have clever writing and interesting characters like the show did? No. But I'll tell you what this film does have. It subverts the idea of what true love and true love's kiss is. You know, like they did in Frozen and Once Upon a Time. Yeah, this film is mostly just a hodgepodge of other ideas taken from other works. And in the meantime, it actually insults one of Disney's greatest films. Okay, before I rip it to shreds, I need to be fair and point out what the positives are, because this film isn't just an irredeemable pile of crap. There are some good points here. Angelina Jolie does a good job as Maleficent, at least with what she's given. During the film's one scene that's lifted directly from the original film, she does come across as an intimidating, towering figure who has charm and charisma. This film has many faults. Casting Angelina Jolie as Maleficent wasn't one of them. While we're on the subject, Isabel Malloy, the actress playing the younger Maleficent, is just phenomenal. I don't know what it is, but her entire performance just feels so genuine, and it never comes across like a performance to me. It comes across as very natural. She's not even on screen for very long, but she takes advantage of every second that she is. As you'd expect, some of the costume work is pretty good. There's some creativity with some of the visuals and creatures. Like Alice in Wonderland, it may look fake, but the aesthetics and creativity is there. And Elle Fanning, while not doing an amazing job, does alright. The film is also only 90 minutes, so it does move at a brisk pace, and there are some good ideas and potential here. It's just that potential isn't fully realized. Okay, that's most of the positives. Now let's dive into the problems. A lot of people have criticized this film for taking one of Disney's greatest villains and turning them into nothing more than a misunderstood loner who temporarily loses her way. And I'll admit, I was thinking along that same line as well, until I really stopped and thought about Wicked. That play took a villain that's even more iconic and more terrifying than Maleficent and does basically what this version does. It reinvents the character so that she's far more sympathetic. So I had to ask, why was Wicked celebrated for doing something that this film ended up being despised for doing, and with a less iconic villain to boot? Well, for one thing, the writing in Wicked is a lot smarter and the characters are more interesting, but I also think the part of the appeal of Wicked is that technically, maybe aside from a few plot hiccups, it's a story that could theoretically exist within the framework of the original story. It fills in a lot of gaps, and yeah, it may alter your perception of events that happened within the original story, but the story is so well constructed that it feels like it could exist. Like, we're getting the behind-the-scenes story while the main story is going on simultaneously, kind of similar to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. In this film, you can't say that. It's not trying to fill in any gaps or being a kind of, this is what's really going on story. It's simply a retelling of the original story, just with Maleficent as the hero. And like I said, maybe people would have been more forgiving of that if the film was smarter or more entertaining or something, but it's not. What's particularly strange about this film is, despite the fact that it had free range to do whatever they wanted, it would still bend over backwards to try to incorporate elements of the story from the original film, even when it breaks narrative or character consistency. For instance, the one scene lifted directly from the original film, the one where Maleficent curses Aurora, ends with Maleficent being the one who gives the true love's kiss addendum to the curse, not one of the fairies, even though in this scene it makes no sense for her to do so. But they had to do it because, they can't have Maleficent be too evil in order for her to have a redemption arc. Not that that stopped Disney later, but we'll get to that. But anyway, that's the main issue with the core concept of the film. How's everything else? Not great. While I mentioned that some of the performances were fine, given what they had to work with, others are less than stellar. Brenton Thwaites plays Prince Philip, and he is just so bland and uninteresting and not engaging to watch. And then there's Sharlto Copley's performance as King Stefan. Now, this is a guy who can be really talented, and he's been great in movies like District 9, Free Fire, and Hardcore Henry, but I don't think he was the right pick. I think the idea behind his character is that he's supposed to have become mad with power, but there's also supposed to be an air of tragedy about him. It's kind of like a how has he fallen so far from where he started kind of arc. But there's two problems with his performance. One, he's not intimidating in the slightest. And two, you don't feel for him at the end at all, even though I think the film expects us to, but I'm honestly not sure. And sure, there's the issue that it's not the same character as the original film, but whatever. He was a pretty flat character in the original film. I can overlook that. What I can't overlook is what this film did to the three fairies. Oh my dear, this is painful. The three fairies in the original film were brave, resourceful, intelligent, had active, likable personalities, and were brimming with character. They were essentially the true main characters of the story. But in this film, they've been reduced to comic relief, except now they're complete imbeciles who accidentally almost kill Aurora several times, which maybe I could forgive if they were charming or likable or funny, but they're not. They're annoying and irritating. And that's the tragic irony with this film. When it's trying to tie into Sleeping Beauty, it can be borderline unbearable. But when it's trying to be its own thing, it's actually not that bad. With some rewrites, taking certain plots out and expanding on others, you could probably make a decent film out of this. I actually kind of wish this film was solely about the relationship between Maleficent and Stefan, how they met, how they fell in love, how they drifted apart, and how he ultimately betrayed her, instead of just rushing through it quickly in the prologue. I would have even been fine with a film that was just all about Maleficent's childhood, maybe kind of like exploring her backstory, kind of like a PG or PG-13 version of Joker. Like I said, they had an amazing actress playing young Maleficent, and they wouldn't have had to worry about stepping on the toes of the original. So this only raises the question, why didn't they just try to make it its own thing? Why didn't Disney try to create their own brand new live-action fairy tale with a modern spin? Personally, I think it could have been interesting. It certainly would have been better than what we got, but no. Instead, they had to go the Wicked route because Wicked was really, really popular at the time, and it's safer market-wise to say that this is a spin-off of an already existing property. And I get it, it's a business. Sometimes you have to go with what will work from a marketing perspective and work within the limitations that you have. But all I can say is from a creative standpoint, making this into a reimagining of Sleeping Beauty was a terrible mistake. Maleficent gets a 4 out of 10. But give the film a little bit of credit, at least except for one scene. It doesn't copy the original film scene for scene, but it just goes to show that just because a remake is different from its predecessor, that in and of itself doesn't make it good. You actually have to replace the material with something substantive or fresh. Cinderella, starring Lily James as Cinderella, Cate Blanchett as Lady Tremaine, and directed by Kenneth Branagh. Opinions about this one seem to be a bit all over the place, with some saying it's just as bad as the other live-action remakes, while others say it's one of the few bright spots. Me personally, yeah, I'm in the latter camp. I really do genuinely like this film. I thought maybe this film would be worse or not as good on a second watch, but no, I liked it just as much this time around as I did 5 years ago. And I think the reason for that is that this does what a remake should do. It tells the same basic story, but there are enough differences to make it its own unique version, while staying true to the source material. In fact, in some ways, it actually does improve upon the story in the original film. For instance, the prince in this film has more personality and more screen time devoted to him, and Richard Madden gives a solid performance. I know, not exactly a high bar, but that's my point. The original Cinderella has room for improvement, or room to tell the story in a slightly different way. There is a case to be made for a Cinderella remake. And this film, I think, takes advantage of it. It doesn't reinvent the story like Ever After did, but it doesn't need to. There are a few modern updates, but not in a way that feels distracting. For instance, the stepmother's treatment of Cinderella feels like a more realistic portrayal of parental abuse than the animated version, but not in a way that feels overblown. We also get to see a relationship form between Cinderella and the prince. It's not a lot, but it's far more than the original film, and it helps that the actors have legit chemistry with each other. Speaking of which, let's talk about the woman of the hour. Lily James was a perfect pick for Cinderella. She exemplifies the kindness of the character, but also shows a much more vulnerable and broken side, almost like she's shocked and numbed by her painful experiences, like you would expect for someone who suffered like she has to be. For instance, we actually see her crack and break down crying after the stepfamily refuses her a ride at the table, and it feels like she's really hurt and heartbroken. But then when she has her moments of kindness, like when she gives the fairy godmother, disguised as an old woman, some milk, she feels genuinely kind. It doesn't feel like she's acting, like she's pretending to be kind. The original Cinderella was already the best of the pre-Renaissance Disney princesses, and this version is about on par. There aren't any major improvements, but there aren't any major downgrades either. Both versions are similar, but slightly different, but they're both good in their own way, so it's really just a matter of personal preference. Kenneth Branagh can be very hit or miss when it comes to directing, but he was the right choice to help bring the story to life. This is the guy who's adapted a few Shakespeare plays to the big screen, and I get the feeling that he feels most at home when he's directing a period piece. So this film definitely plays to his strengths. The film is gorgeous to look at with elegant costumes, incredible production design, and some really creative and dazzling visuals when it comes to the fairy godmother's transformation scenes. And speaking of which, Helena Bonham Carter is quite good as the fairy godmother. While I personally prefer the more grandmotherly figure in the original film, I do enjoy the more scatterbrained but still likable portrayal in this film. I also really like Cate Blanchett's portrayal as Lady Tremaine. While the original film has the more iconic villain, I think this version's a lot more intelligent. For instance, rather than simply refuse to have Cinderella marry the prince, she actually has a plan that allows Cinderella to marry the prince, just so long as she gets something in return. And when that doesn't work, she has a backup plan on top of that that's intelligent and organic. She's actually a far more pragmatic antagonist than the original, which, in some respects, actually kind of makes her scarier. But the film doesn't just brush her with one single evil stroke, but actually gives her a level of dimension by giving us hints of a backstory that show us how she's been molded into the cold, cruel person that she's become, and it allows her to be a compelling foil for Cinderella. Most issues I have with this film are nitpicks. Like the mice and Lucifer the cat seem pretty superfluous in this version, and are only in here because they exist in the original film, even if they don't do much. There's occasionally a line that's a bit clumsy or a bit too schmaltzy for my taste, and the stepsister's role in the story seems a bit confused. While the actresses that play them aren't bad at all, the film can't seem to decide if they're genuinely malicious like the original animated film, or just clueless and are following their mother's lead like the original Charles Perrault version. The film seems like it kind of wants it to be half and half, and it doesn't work. For instance, in their final scene where they apologize to Cinderella, I have no idea if the film is trying to say that they're genuinely sorry for the way they treated Cinderella, or if they're just trying to cozy up to her, or were afraid she might retaliate against them now that she'll be queen. But overall, these are minor issues. By and large, this film has genuine charm and is just so likable from start to finish. And yeah, sure, this film was probably made because Disney higher-ups demanded it, but it feels like the writers and the director and the actors had a love and affinity for the original film, and it shines through. Is it perfect? No, but it doesn't have to be. Cinderella gets an 8 out of 10 from me. It's a delightful fairy tale with just enough of a modern spin without being distracting, while still maintaining the fairy tale feel. I really enjoyed it. The Jungle Book 2016. This one often gets pointed to as the Disney live-action remake done correctly, and yeah, I can't really argue with that. It hits every note that a remake should do. It tells the same basic story, but has enough differences to make itself stand out. It has a love for the original film, and most importantly, it actually picks a film for which there is room for improvement. As such, this is the one Disney live-action remake that I think is unambiguously better than the original. Let's start with the surface level stuff. Firstly, the look of this film is simply amazing. I mean, the backgrounds are almost completely CG and they look incredible. You can practically feel the textures, they look so real. The animals, while obviously still CG, also look amazing. They look like the real animals, but are also able to convey so much emotion without crossing over into the uncanny valley. This film is a real technical achievement and is worth watching just for the look of the film alone. The film's cast is also really incredible. Ben Kingsley as Bagheera, Bill Murray as Baloo, Idris Elba as Shere Khan, Lupita Nyong'o as Raksha, Scarlett Johansson as Ka, Giancarlo Esposito as Akela. These are all incredible picks, and they're either on par with or an improvement over the original film. Even the ones that you think won't work, like Christopher Walken as King Louis, surprisingly they work rather well. I actually like that they make King Louis something akin to an Italian gangster. That was actually really funny. But let's talk about the star of the show, Neil Sethi as Mowgli. Now, one of the big issues I had with the original film is that I thought Mowgli was a poorly written protagonist. He was whiny, he was annoying, he was stupid, and he didn't act like someone who had grown up living in the jungle. Or at least not someone who grew up living in the jungle that would live that long. That's not the case with this Mowgli. I actually believe that this Mowgli was raised and grew up in the jungle. It also helps that in this film, he shows much more of a connection with the wolf pack that raised him, as opposed to the original film where he doesn't even give them a second thought once he leaves them. I also thought they handled his character arc surprisingly well. Okay, it's not done with the level of complexity of the books, but it certainly captures it better than either of the two versions prior. In this version, he struggles with being too much of a man in an animal world. For instance, he makes all sorts of contraptions or inventions that make things easier living in the jungle, and all the other animals criticize him for it. This creates tension between him and the other animals, and it establishes how he's different from them. But the film also doesn't ignore his more animalistic side either. Now, we don't get to see him interact with the humans in this version, most likely because that's something they're saving for the sequel, but we do see him howl, scavenge, and climb trees with ease. While Neil Sethi can be very hit or miss, when he nails a scene, he nails it. More times than not, when he's interacting with something that's clearly not there, I believe that he believes he's talking to someone. That's not easy for even a lot of adult actors to do, let alone a child actor. But he does a really good job. I'm actually surprised that he managed to do as good a job as he did. Like the scene where he first says goodbye to the wolf pack, it really feels like he's heartbroken over having to say goodbye to the only family he ever knew. And when he gives his wolf mother a final goodbye hug, I did not have a hard time believing that he was really giving Raksha that goodbye hug. It's both a credit to the actor's performance and the incredible visual effects. Shere Khan is also a really great character in this version. While the original had a bit more dignity and sophistication, as one would expect for a character voiced by George Sanders, here they portray him more as a savage, unforgiving beast. Someone as cold, harsh, and merciless as the jungle itself. And Idris Elba gives a chilling performance, making even the simplest of lines goosebump-inducing. The scene where he's casually talking to Raksha's pups is a genuinely unnerving moment that completely took me off guard when I first saw it. I also like the Baloo in this version. They portray him as something akin to a con artist who over time does grow to genuinely like Mowgli. Being voiced by Bill Murray helps give weight and importance to this interpretation of the character. And while yes, this film is still very much a Disneyfication of the original story, I do appreciate that they took more elements from the original Rudyard Kipling books, like The Law of the Jungle and The Water Truce. This is a remake that understood that there was a rich source material for which they could draw inspiration from, and they did. That's not to say the film is perfect, though. There are a few minor issues that I do have with it. For instance, they do that stupid scene where Baloo has to pretend he doesn't want to be Mowgli's friend anymore to try to get him to go to the man village, and yeah, I'm not a fan of this cliche at all, and they don't do it that well here. And like I said, Neil Sethi can be hit or miss. When he's great, but there are moments where his delivery is just maybe a little too flat, and they probably should have done a few more takes. And there are a few times where the film feels like it has to have a callback to the original film, even if it's not needed. For instance, Christopher Walken as King Louie sings I Wanna Be Like You, and it feels forced in this more grounded narrative. Using the bare necessities works fine because it makes sense in context. I Wanna Be Like You doesn't. And another issue I have is that I do wish the film was allowed to be a little bit darker. The jungle is supposed to be a very cutthroat and unforgiving place, and we do get a sense of this, but in my opinion, not enough. Only 4 characters die, and 2 of them are villains, and I wish the film was allowed to have a higher body count. Like when Bagheera and Baloo are fighting off a pack of monkeys at the temple, and it feels like they're, for lack of a better term, pulling their punches. The monkeys just get right back up, and none of them die or even show signs that they've been seriously wounded, even though you know the 2 of them could very easily rip them to shreds. I think it's because Disney didn't want this film to be PG-13, but they clearly didn't have an issue with Mulan being PG-13, so I don't see why this would have been a problem. The film was already pretty intense for a PG rating. I think they should have just made this into a PG-13. But I don't want you to leave the impression that I didn't like this film. Far from it. I do think this is a legitimately great film. When this film is good, it's not just good, it's great. It's enjoyable, it pretty well balances a slightly darker and more mature tone, while still having the same sense of fun that the original had. The characters are wonderful, the film looks amazing, and out of all 3 of the Disney adaptations of The Jungle Book, this one comes the closest to capturing Mowgli's character arc. The Jungle Book gets an 8 out of 10. And I think this one works as well as it does, like I've been saying throughout this video, is there is room for improvement when compared to the original film. Just so long as Disney doesn't start remaking films that are already virtually perfect just the way they are, then we'll be okay. Alice Through the Looking Glass, the totally necessary sequel to the interesting but deeply flawed 2010 Alice in Wonderland remake. I mean, yeah, the first one was kind of a mess, but oh boy, this is awful. Where in the world do I even start with this? Let's start with the plot. So, Alice returns to Wonderland via a mirror, and she's told by all her Wonderland friends, who actually get very little screen time or do barely anything compared to the first film, but whatever, that the Mad Hatter is dying because I guess he got reminded that his family was dead and he just misses them so much that he's starting to die. Okay. And Alice figures the only way to save the Hatter is to bring his family back from the dead. So she travels to Time's castle and steals a time machine called the Chronosphere. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a bit. And tries to use it to save the Hatter's family and Hatter himself. But unbeknownst to her, sort of, again, we'll get to that in a bit, her time-traveling antics could lead to the destruction of the entirety of Wonderland, past, present, and future. Okay, so, a time-traveling story in Wonderland. Let's put aside the circumstances of how Alice got the time machine for just a moment. The idea of Alice time traveling through Wonderland, I'm not gonna lie, I actually kind of like. I mean, I'm a sucker for time traveling stories because it opens up a lot of story possibilities. But the time travel element feels particularly useless in the story. For one thing, not only do we learn that the past can't be changed, but we also find out, without giving away too much, that the time traveling was completely irrelevant for the plot. The only thing that happens is that Alice witnesses certain events in the past without altering them, none of which encourages or inspires her to affect the plot whatsoever. And she figures out a crucial piece of information to save Hatter, which she actually could have learned anyway without time traveling. And that's one of the film's biggest problems. The script is terrible. And yeah, the script of the first one was pretty terrible too. But to give credit to that film, at least the scenes don't feel completely and utterly irrelevant and disconnected from each other. At least the scenes build on top of each other and flow with some semblance of narrative cohesion. Here, the plot is a jumbled mess. For example, there's a strange scene where Alice, for some weird reason that's never really explained, wakes up in the real world in an asylum and has to escape to make her way back to Wonderland. What was the point of that? It adds nothing to the narrative and is not brought up again. Its only accomplishment is that it wastes 5 minutes of screen time. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I first saw this in the theater 5 years ago. I'm not kidding when I say you could literally cut it out of the film and you would lose nothing. I guess it's in the film to add an action scene or possibly to remind viewers that women used to be locked away for female hysteria, but its placement in the story is just baffling. The film's pacing is horrendous, jumping all around all over the place without a clear, coherent vision. It doesn't help that this film is as dull as a bag of rocks, which makes this film drag and drag. It makes 113 minutes feel like 3 hours. Maybe it's supposed to be a metaphor about how time is relative. There's also the film's obsession with trying to explain things that didn't need explaining in either of the first film or the animated film. Do you remember how the Red Queen, or rather the Queen of Hearts, hated white roses in the original animated film? Do you want to know why she hates white roses? What's that? You don't care? You never thought to ask that question? Well, too bad. This film's going to offer you an explanation anyway. Don't you want to know why it was always tea time when Alice first came to the Mad Tea Party? What's that, you say? You just assumed it was because the participants were all mad? Silly you, of course there's a rational explanation. Because that's what we all wanted, right? A rational explanation to explain the illogicalities behind a world that runs entirely on nonsense. Okay, let's get into by far the biggest problem with this film. And that's Alice herself, or rather, her actions. Now, Mia Wasikowska actually does a better job this time around performance-wise. No, the problem here is with the writing of the character. Look, it's nice that she wants to try to help out Hatter, but not at the cost of risking both the existence of Wonderland and time itself. Which begs the question, why didn't time tell Alice that taking the Chronosphere would result in the destruction of Wonderland? Not that it would have made any difference anyway, because even when she does learn the truth, she still refuses to give it back. But why didn't he do it? But putting that aside, the film expects us to root for Alice for taking something that's highly volatile and dangerous, I might add, that doesn't belong to her. This actually makes time the closest thing the film has to someone acting genuinely heroic, and the film, for some reason, expects you to see him as something of an antagonist, at least at first. There's also this subplot where the film explains where the Red Queen got her massive head from, which again, no one was asking for, and then attempts to use this sad backstory as a way to, not necessarily excuse her bad behavior, but by the end, the film expects you to have some level of sympathy for her. But did the writers of this film forget about how awful she was in the first film? The number of dead she left behind in her wake is ginormous. I don't care how sad you make her backstory, I'm not gonna feel sorry for her. So yeah, this film has a bizarre obsession with asking you to root for or sympathize with people who do terrible or stupid things, and ask you to root against people who are either doing nothing wrong or are completely understandable in their actions. As such, it reeks of a film that is completely disconnected and out of touch with its audience. Is there anything to like in this film? Well, some of the visuals are kind of creative. Like, the look of the Castle of Eternity is kind of neat. Sacha Baron Cohen gives a good performance as Time. He's got a cool design. There's also a scene where Time sits down at the Mad Tea Party and makes all kinds of time puns. Okay, that was kind of fun. And like I said before, Mia Wasikowska's performance as Alice did improve from the original film. Aside from that, though, no, there's nothing here. Nothing. I was hoping that maybe this film wasn't quite as bad as I had remembered. Maybe there was more to admire about it that I missed the first time. But no. If anything, it was even worse the second time around. This is a complete mess, and there's very little redeeming about it whatsoever. Alice with the Looking Glass gets a 2 out of 10. It's just so sad that this happened to be the final film of Alan Rickman, and in a film where he barely says anything. He deserved a better swan song. Okay, so technically I'm cheating by including this film, because the original Peach Dragon is a mostly live action film, so it doesn't really count as a Disney live action remake by definition. But given this film came out during the time Disney was releasing a glut of these remakes, and because at least part of the original film is animated, I feel justified in including it here. And also, I just wanted to remind people that this movie exists. Because this movie is not only good, I think it's great. Now, full disclosure, I actually haven't seen the original Peach Dragon, so I don't know how closely it follows it, so just keep that in mind. One of the things that really struck me about this film was how it felt like it was a film that would have been made in the 1980s, and I mean that as a compliment. It's very much got an E.T. vibe in terms of plot, but the progression and tone reminded me of the 60s, 70s era live action Disney films. Good 60s to 70s Disney films, I should clarify. It has a quaint, low-key charm that you can't really describe, but you can certainly feel. And honestly, I think I could summarize this film in just one word. Charming. Yeah, sure, it's not really that new, and the tale it's presenting is actually pretty straightforward, but the way the story is written, the way the characters are written and performed, the presentation, I don't know, somehow it manages to breathe life into it. The performances from everybody are wonderful, from Oakes Fegley giving a great performance as Pete, Una Lawrence is also great as Natalie, the young girl. Child actors can be very hit or miss with their performances, but these two really knock it out of the park. They're just so natural. And Bryce Dallas Howard, Wes Bentley, Carl Urban, and Robert Redford all do phenomenal work, and are clearly giving it their all, and the effort really pays off. Elliot is also a great character. Not only are his movements so great, I mean, he really honestly moves like a real wild animal would move, but I actually like the decision to make him furry instead of scaly. He still looks menacing enough, but the fur also gives him a warm, comforting feel that makes it easy to buy that Pete wouldn't be scared of him. The film's pacing is absolutely brisk. It's never too rushed or too slow. Every scene feels important. It always feels like it's the perfect length. So the film breezes right by. The end result is a film that's just so irresistible from start to finish, and one that I actually have very, very few issues with. In fact, there's really only one problem I have with the film, and it's that the motivations for the villain, Gavin, are extremely undercooked. Even he himself admits that he doesn't really have a clue what his plan is. I mean, the film doesn't make him just a flat OTT villain, as they do show that he has a human side. To the film's credit, it's not that they portray him as evil, but more like he's just misguided. But at the same time, in order for him to work better as an antagonist, I think his motivations needed to be made clearer. Maybe he, like Robert Redford's character, Meacham, could see Elliot prior to the events of the movie and nobody believed him, and this acts as a motivator for his actions. Like, maybe he wants to prove to the town that he's not crazy. This not only would help make some of his actions easier to swallow, but it would also allow him to be a compelling foil to Meacham. But honestly, that's really my only complaint with this film. It's just so charming and delightful and entertaining that it's a flaw that I can easily overlook. There's honestly not that much more to say. I'm going to give Peach Dragon a 9 out of 10. I'll admit, a part of me is genuinely shocked that not only did Disney allow this film to be made at all, I mean, Peach Dragon is not really one of their better known films, but that it managed to turn out this good. And I think part of that may very well be that Disney was likely very hands-off with this film. Like, this feels like something the filmmaker actually wanted to make. I mean, it wasn't like this was going to be one of their tentpole releases like Lion King or Mulan, and so they were probably apathetic and largely let the director, David Lowery, do what he wanted. I mean, sure, the movie made money, but it wasn't like it was a smash hit or anything. And it just kind of did okay. In fact, as the years pass, it seems like people have mostly forgotten about it already, and that's a shame, because this really is a gem of a family film. If this managed to slip past your radar, it's worth checking out. See it. Beauty and the Beast 2017. Well, this is a movie. It's a movie that it exists. Okay, let's get the obvious problem out of the way right out of the gate. The original animated film was already perfect as is. I mean, it was an animated film that managed to get nominated for Best Picture all the way back in 1991, when they only had 5 nominees. So the idea of doing a remake of an already perfect film means you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. Change too much, people will complain because, hey, you're messing with a story that's already perfect. Change too little, well, then people will complain that you're just copying the original film. And, well, why would they watch your version when they could just watch the original instead? And that's probably the core issue with this film. Its existence is completely pointless. You can get used to hearing me say that from this point on. And out of all the remakes whose existence is completely pointless, this is the best of the bunch. What are the differences here that could be used to justify its existence? Well, none, but what are some of the differences regardless? Well, LeFou is gay in this version, something that's only hinted at and not made explicit and doesn't affect the story one bit. There's added layers to the curse, such as the storybook that lets beasts travel anywhere in the world, and the fact that the servants will turn to inanimate objects if the curse becomes permanent, which, again, doesn't really affect the story, and it actually makes the witch seem like a much worse person than I think they were intending. There's the song Evermore. It's alright, it's a good song. And again, you could cut the song out and it wouldn't affect the narrative. And there's an occasional amusing moment, like Belle asking the prince at the end if he'd be willing to grow a beard, or Maurice's reaction to seeing Chip for the first time. Speaking of which, Kevin Kline is exceptional as Maurice. He's probably the only actor who actually improves upon the character in the original film. But okay, while we're on the subject, how well cast is this film? For the most part, not too bad. Emma Watson as Belle, while certainly no Paige O'Hara, especially when it comes to singing, she does just fine. The film script tries to add dimension to her character by making her slightly more headstrong than the animated version, but honestly, it doesn't really amount to much. Luke Evans is actually really good as Gaston. He is clearly having the time of his life playing one of Disney's most iconic villains, even if he doesn't quite have the voice for it. Josh Gad is fine as LeFou, I guess, although there are moments and lines of his that are genuinely groan-inducing. And the actors playing the servants don't leave as much of an impression as they did in the original film, but they work fine with what they're given. That being said, the one I'm not crazy about is Dan Stevens as the Beast. Now, he handles the half end of the film just fine, but I have a real problem believing in the first half that he's supposed to be this kind of half-animal, half-man creature. And to be fair to him, I'm not entirely sure it was his fault. I actually blame the writing here. You never really get the sense in this version that his mind is fighting between the animal and the man side of him, which isn't something you can say about the original film. In the original animated film, he moved a lot more like a wild animal at first, walking on all fours, and he'd get furious at the slightest provocation. But the longer he spends with Belle, the less animalistic he becomes, which gives the audience a feel like he's being tamed. But instead, this version just makes him extra abrasive and rude. There's nothing really beastly about his behavior. He just so happens to be an extra rude guy who looks ugly. I guess this was done to try to make the romance more palatable to modern audiences, but if anything, it almost kind of makes it worse, because you don't really get the sense in this film that his mind is being, like, transformed like you do in the original, so it almost kind of makes him seem like even more of a jerk, ironically. It should also be pointed out that this film is also the longest of the Disney live-action remakes to date, clocking it at a whopping 129 minutes. And keep in mind, this was for an animated film that originally had a succinct runtime of 84 minutes. So, this film adds roughly 45 minutes of content to tell more or less the same story in a less interesting, less engaging, and less entertaining way. And how can it be that in a film that has much less screen time, I truly believe that the two characters had fallen in love with each other And yet, in this longer, live action version, the romance doesn't feel anywhere near as strong. When the film reaches the iconic, beautiful, sweeping, romantic ballroom scene from the original film, I mean, sure, it looks really, really pretty, but the pathos is nowhere near as strong as it was in the animated film. But that being said, it's still there. It's not like it's completely stripped away. I mean, I'm not frustrated with this film. It still maintains quite a bit of what made the original animated film so good. I mean, the songs are still as nice as before, the basic plot still works really good, and for all the film's problems, for the most part, it looks gorgeous. Sometimes you get a scene where the color scheme's a little bit too muted, but during moments like the Be Our Guest song number, the film looks dazzling, and this was wonderful to see on the big screen. So yeah, is this a good film? No. Did it need to exist? No. But if you decided to sit down and watch it, would you hate yourself? I certainly don't think so. At best, it's a harmless time waster that's not that insulting. I honestly kept going back and forth as to what my rating for this film would be, but I decided to be nice and give this a razor thin 6 out of 10. And the only reason the 6 won out instead of the 5 is because the strengths of the original film do shine through in the end. It's not annoying, and there was at least an attempt made to try to tell at least certain aspects of the story differently. They didn't work and were often just pointless, but at least this one tried somewhat. Christopher Robin. Yeah, again, technically this isn't really a Disney live-action remake, but more like a Disney live-action sequel. But anyway, this film follows the story of Christopher Robin as an adult reconnecting with the Hundred Acre Wood citizens during a particularly stressful week at his job where he has to stay at home and work while his wife and daughter embark on a trip to his old childhood home for rest and relaxation. So, yeah, basically this is Hook, but with Winnie the Pooh characters instead of Peter Pan. So I guess you could technically say this film is kind of, sort of a remake, just for Hook and not Winnie the Pooh. And if I'm being perfectly honest, this was actually a really good idea. Given the themes of the original Winnie the Pooh stories and the Disney animations, this just feels like a natural progression for the characters and story. And since I might as well compare the two, I have to admit, I actually like this film quite a bit more than I do Hook. And while I like Hook fine, it does go on way too long, and the film does falter quite a bit in the third act. This film is consistent from beginning to end. It moves at just the right pace, and it has a good, solid ending. But let's get some of the less than stellar elements out of the way first. As you would expect, this is not the most original of plots. I mean, like I said, Hook did this 27 years prior. And one trope that I find that's exceptionally difficult to get right in media, especially kids' films, is the overworked or workaholic parent. More often than not, it comes across like the story is saying that work, i.e. financially supporting your family, in and of itself is bad. And I'll admit, at first I was worried that they were going to go down that same path here too. I mean, yeah, if I was in Christopher Robin's shoes, wherein he has to find a way to make enough budget cuts while minimizing staff cuts in a limited amount of time, I'd probably stay home too. I mean, people's livelihoods are on the line. But the more the film went on and the more I thought about it, the more I figured I think I see what the film was going for. The film showcases that it was the choices that he made for his career in the past at the expense of his family is what led him to this point. And now, because of those past choices, he's being forced to bear the brunt of this incredible responsibility. So again, it's not really so much that working is bad, like it so easily could have been, but rather he let the work consume him entirely, and he also allowed himself to be easily manipulated by one of his bosses. Like I said, this is a tightrope act, and it very easily could have faltered, especially given that it's a cliche that I'm not very fond of. And I'll be honest, I'm actually astonished that they pulled this off as well as they did. There's also a few really quick nitpicks that I want to point out before we dive into the really good stuff. There's an occasional awkward line here and there, like at the end, when Christopher Robin stands up to his boss and calls him a woozle, and the boss's father calls him a woozle right back. Yeah, I mean, it's a little amusing, but it felt forced. Although to the actor's credit, they are trying their hardest to make it sound natural. I'm also not sure how I feel about the voice actors. I mean, you have Jim Cummings coming back as Winnie the Pooh and Tigger, and Brad Garrett as Eeyore. Okay, those make sense. But the rest of the voice actors barely even attempt to sound like the other characters, particularly Peter Capaldi as the voice of Rabbit. But I guess you could also make the argument that this is based more on the Winnie the Pooh books rather than the cartoons. And since Winnie the Pooh takes place in the UK, it does make sense to hire British actors rather than Americans to play the characters in this version, even if they don't really sound like their predecessors. But yeah, if you're used to hearing the iconic voices of the original Winnie the Pooh voice cast, that can be distracting. But they're not in the film for very long, so I would argue it's a minor point at best. But okay, that's all the issues with the film. What's great about it? Quite a bit, actually. The performances, for the most part, are really, really good. Jim Cummings, unsurprisingly, is amazing as Pooh, and really good as Tigger. I also really do like Brad Garrett's performance as Eeyore. Not only does he get some of the funniest lines in the entire film, but his amazingly flat and dry delivery makes already funny punchlines even funnier. Ewan McGregor is good as Christopher Robin, capturing the workaholic who gets frustrated easily, the lost soul trying to recapture his childhood innocence, and the loving, if somewhat misguided husband and father. Haley Atwell is a great presence as his wife Evelyn. Bronte Carmichael, who plays Christopher Robin's daughter Madeline, is delightful and charming. And like I've been saying all throughout this video, it can be difficult to act when you're acting against something that isn't really there, especially for a child actor. And for about half of her screen time, she has to talk to creatures that aren't really there. But amazingly, I never doubted for a second that she was really talking to them. And Mark Gatiss is rather amusing as Christopher Robin's slimy boss. While the film's plot is kinda stock, the film's real strength is in its characters. And to be perfectly honest, that's always been the case with Winnie the Pooh. The stories were kind of almost secondary. What was most important was the characters, their interactions, their reactions, etc. And if there's one cast of characters that Disney just seems to understand the most, it would be the Winnie the Pooh characters. And this film is absolutely no exception. The characters, particularly Winnie the Pooh himself, are pretty much the exact same characters we know and love, but instead of being viewed in the backdrop of childhood innocence, the backdrop is now the dull, muted, almost harsh adult world, which creates a rather jarring juxtaposition. And yet, even in the midst of the confusing trials of the adult world, the Hundred Acre Wood characters don't lose a shred of their innocence and childlike wonder and mentality. And there is something to be said about a film that craves the virtues of doing nothing and cherishing the quiet moments you spend with your friends and family. The visual effects are absolutely incredible. I mean, really, really great. I have absolutely no trouble believing that the citizens of the Hundred Acre Wood are really there in the shots. The textures just look so real that you can feel like you can touch it. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, and it was rightly earned. The CG characters blend in so perfectly with the real world that it's actually genuinely awe-inspiring. And what makes it particularly effective is there's never really any moment where it feels like it's just trying to show off the effects, but rather they serve the needs of the plot. It's not flashy, it's not in your face, but rather the effects are subdued, and that makes it all the better. It's also surprising how funny this film can get at times. Like I said before, Eeyore gets all the great one-liners. There's also some great moments where other people see the Hundred Acre Wood citizens for who they are, and their reactions to them are just really fun. But above all, the one thing that helps elevate this film is its down-to-earth charm. This is a legitimately charming, sweet, and moving movie. And to me, Winnie the Pooh was always about the charm in utter simplicity, and this film captures that to a T. I'm going to give Christopher Robin a 9 out of 10. I really, really like this movie. It's genuinely charming and wondrously pleasant and a treat for kids and adults alike. Well, I hope you enjoyed the positive reviews while they lasted, because unless Lady and the Tramp really surprises me, it's all downhill from here. Dumbo. You know, out of all the Disney live-action remakes, this is the one that I was both simultaneously thinking that a remake of this really didn't need to exist, but I was also curious as to see how exactly they were going to remake it and what choices they would make to readapt the story. especially when I saw that Tim Burton was directing it. Unfortunately, it's not a very good film. It's not awful, and at least it's not a scene-for-scene recreation of the original film, which is nice, but at the same time, it doesn't replace it with anything substantive either. Let's get some of the positives out of the way. Visually speaking, this film does look really good. I mean, Dumbo in particular is so well animated. I mean, just the texture on his ears looks so amazing. And what makes it so great is that they don't necessarily try to make him look super realistic, but rather they focused on making him more expressive. He looks and acts real enough, but the way he moves, the way he walks, he has a lot of personality and is filled with character. And some of the effects, while they don't really advance the plot, do look really nice, like the visually stunning callback to the pink elephant scene with Danny Elfman's nice, quirky little rendition in the background. There's an occasional amusing moment, and I do like the camaraderie that forms between the circus performers. Aside from that, though, there's really not that much to get into with this film. The original Dumbo had more of a focus on the circus animals, with the humans in the background. When this film, though, it's the opposite. The humans are the main focus, and the circus animals are either barely focused on or are only focused on tangentially. It almost kind of gets to the point where Dumbo feels like a supporting character in his own movie. Now, in theory, this sounds like it could work. I mean, if you're going to remake Dumbo, and you make the decision to have none of the animals talk, then there really isn't another option. So if this is going to be a more human-centric Dumbo, you would think they'd pull out all the stops and make sure the humans were well written and played by talented actors who are at the top of their game. Oh, how I wish. With very few exceptions, most of the performances, at least from the main characters, just don't work. Colin Farrell is alright, but there's nothing really that good about his performance. He's just kind of generic. Danny DeVito is alright as the ringmaster of the smaller circus, but he's basically just giving a typical Danny DeVito performance just with no swearing. But still, he does get a few laughs every now and then. The actors playing the two main kids are very wooden. Now, I don't like pointing out when child actors are bad, because I'm sure they were trying their hardest or were just doing what they are told. But their performances, particularly from the actors playing Millie, just reek of dull surprise. Like, they're not even the least bit engaged by what's going on. And then there's Michael Keaton as V.A. Vandermeer, a super wealthy head of the corporate circus that offers dreams and unlimited imagination on the outside, but on the inside is just a hollow, empty, roofless corporate shell. So yeah, basically Disney. No, I'm not kidding. The film not only doesn't try to hide that Vandermeer is basically Walt Disney, or at least a darker version of him, it actively asks you to make that comparison, which is bizarre to say the least. I don't know, to me, it just feels off anytime a piece of media put out by Disney tries to talk about how these big, bad corporations just don't have the heart or soul to understand what makes for truly imaginative art or whatever. Which is rich, coming from one of the biggest, if not the biggest, entertainment corporation on the planet. Now, Michael Keaton can be a very talented actor. He's been amazing in films like Birdman, The Founder, or even if you want to go further back, Clean and Sober. But something about this performance here just doesn't feel right. It's almost like he's trying to emulate David Carradine in Kill Bill or something. I don't know. I just can't really explain it, but it just feels off. And then by the end, when he goes all ranting and raving mad, it's too silly or goofy to take even the least bit seriously. And it's not like he's a bad pick. Spider-Man Homecoming proved that he can play an intimidating villain. And I'm not sure if this is what he was told to do by Burton or if this was all Keaton, but whatever the case, it doesn't work. Now, the actors playing a lot of the circus freaks are fine. In fact, sometimes they actually get a legit laugh, like when Pramish Singh casually flips a basket of snakes at a group of boys criticizing his act. But by far, the one actor who legitimately stands out is Eva Green as Colette. She's the only actor who seems like she's actually trying and seems legitimately invested in what's going on. But to be fair to the other actors, it's not like they're given a lot to work with. The way the characters are written are pretty bland and generic. I mean, Colin Farrell plays a World War I amputee who lost his wife. That's basically all there is to his character. The little girl is interested in science. That's about it. The boy is so forgettable, I actually can't remember a thing about him, and I just got through re-watching the film. And Michael Keaton's character feels very inconsistent from scene to scene. But by far the biggest problem with the film is the story. The original film was already pretty scant on story. I mean, it was essentially an hour-long cartoon. Now, I love the animated Dumbo. I think it's a real treat because it was charming and funny, and it was well animated, and the characters are lovable. But with the original being so short, there really isn't a lot you can do to remake this without creating a new plot whole cloth. And they try that, but not in a good way. This is your very, very typical story of rich corporation wants to sponsor or buy something that's really unique, but they don't seem to understand what made it special or unique, and demands changes to be made, but in those changes, the uniqueness of the act loses the soul of what made it so unique to begin with. The message is very clear, and the plot is so generic that you know exactly what's going to happen. There are exactly zero surprises here, and there's neither a hint of subversion, nor even a sense of humor or self-awareness about its predictable, lame story. And I'll be honest, I'm not even really sure how you would fix this movie. Unless someone had a really, really good, unique idea, I don't see the need for this movie existing. At all. And you know the only reason this movie was made was because Disney demanded it and the writers were forced into it, not because anyone involved actually had a unique spin on the classic story. And I'll be honest, I'm not even sure I get the reason for why Disney even made this. I mean, yeah, people know about Dumbo, but it's not like Dumbo, at least nowadays, gets brought up as one of the quintessential Disney films like Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King. Remaking those, at least from a business perspective, did at least make some semblance of sense. This remake, I don't see making sense from both a business perspective nor from an artistic perspective. So this might actually be the most pointless out of all the Disney remakes. But for a film that did not need to exist, it's probably a miracle that it turned out this watchable. I'm going to give Dumbo a 5 out of 10. Like I said, it's not awful and you could sit down and watch it. But the story is completely generic, predictable, not really that interesting for a Tim Burton movie. It's surprisingly pretty dull, and with the exceptions of Eva Green and to a lesser extent Danny DeVito, most of the performances range from completely wooden to barely passable. If you're really, really curious, it might be worth the watch, but as a question as to whether or not it's a legitimately good film, the answer is no. Aladdin 2019. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard they were going to remake Aladdin, I thought that this was one of those films that actually had potential. I mean, Aladdin was part adventure film, part action film, and I thought that it had potential as a live action film. But sadly, this film did what so many of the other Disney live action remakes did and didn't create a new narrative, but rather it just decided to copy the plot beats from the original film. Not only is it distracting, it's detrimental to the film. One thing that I noticed was how slow-moving and lethargic everybody is, especially during the musical numbers. And I think it's because the animation in the original film was just so fast and full of energy that when you try to translate it to live action, because humans can't move as fast as cartoon characters, it's very noticeable. Especially when the film is lifting scenes almost identically from the original film, making the comparison all the harder to ignore. And that's the issue. This film does try to copy way too much from the original film. And because this story was originally written to be animated, the flow and pacing of everything just feels a little bit off. Most of the changes are relatively superficial. Some of them are okay, like in Prince Ali, the line, "Brush up your Sunday salam" is replaced with "Brush off your Friday salam," due to Friday being the holy day in Islam. But then the line in that very same song referencing slavery was completely cut out. Because I guess it's not PC to bring up that slavery was a thing back then. Not just in that culture, but in literally every other culture at the time. But that's just song lyrics. What about plot elements? Again, changes are made, but they don't really alter the narrative. For instance, there's a bit where after Jafar wishes to become Sultan, they do this whole thing where he tells the guards that they must obey him because, he's the Sultan now. And they do at first, but then after a pep talk from Jasmine, the guards pledge their loyalty to the original Sultan. But then immediately after that, Jafar wishes to become the greatest sorcerer, which he already did in the original film, so what was the point of that? I guess it was to give Jasmine something more to do in the climax, because its inclusion feels like it's here to just pad out the runtime. In fact, some of the changes they make actually create plot holes. In the original film, they make it very clear that the genie can't use magic at all in the climax to aid the heroes, because he can't defy his current master even the tiniest bit. and that made sense. But in this film, he does use magic to subtly defy Jafar to try to aid in his defeat. So, how much of a slave is the genie if he can use his magic against the wishes and will of his current master? How far exactly does this go? It feels too convenient and inconsistent. Alright, since he's been brought up, let's talk about Will Smith's portrayal of the genie. And yeah, the effect when he's in his genie form looks absolutely terrible, but let's talk about the actual performance. And I will give the writers and Will Smith some credit here. They knew better than to try to copy Robin Williams' portrayal of the genie. His manic energy, his improvisational skills, his comedic timing, it was just so perfect that it would have been impossible to top or match. He was, quite literally, irreplaceable. So Will Smith opted to take a slightly different route with his portrayal of the genie. Rather than be fast-talking and zany, which played to Williams' strengths, Smith opts to portray this genie as someone who's a lot more smoother and more laid back, again, playing to Smith's strengths. Is it better than Williams' portrayal? No, but it's different, and it's different in a good way. And believe it or not, I was actually at least somewhat invested in his romance with Dahlia. Sure, it's pointless to the story, but they actually have good chemistry. I was actually more interested in their relationship than the romantic relationship between the two leads. Speaking of which, let's talk about Aladdin and Jasmine. Again, I'll give the filmmakers credit. They hired two actors who look a lot like their animated counterparts, and they were good actors. They're not miscast. Mena Massoud and especially Naomi Scott are giving it their all. I mean, they are really, really trying. And when they're repeating lines said in the original film, they're actually not that bad. But when they have to say the poorly written lines specifically made for this film, they just can't save them. There's a whole conversation that Aladdin has with the Sultan and Jasmine about jams, and he just rambles on, and it's not funny or charming or anything. It's just painful to sit through. Jasmine is given a different story arc about how she wants to be a sultana, rather than in the first film where she didn't want to have anything to do with royalty or being a princess. So, okay, at first I was going to say that a sultana would not exactly be welcomed by the average commoner in this time and culture with open arms, but, well, upon some last minute research, I saw that there actually were female sultanas. They were rare, but they did exist. And as a side note, I should also point out that they didn't exist in the period when the story seems to take place. But okay, I'll give the film a little leeway here. The problem is the way that her arc is handled in the story. It feels needlessly shoehorned in, rather than organically woven into the narrative. The two pieces just don't fit together. In the original animated film, Jasmine was tired of the constraints of the palace, which is why the scene where he takes her out on the magic carpet to show her the world was so amazing to her. It allowed her to see far beyond what she was used to, far beyond what she ever thought was possible, and it made the moment all the more magical to her, and therefore to us, the audience. Here, the whole tired of the palace constraints aspect of her character is downplayed, if not removed entirely. So the whole new world segment doesn't feel as impactful or magical this time around. And that's the thing. If they wanted to make her want to be like the first female sultana or whatever, that'd be fine. But then they needed to construct a new narrative to support it. But then they'd have to deviate even more from the original film, and they didn't want to do that. And like I said, Naomi Scott is really, really trying, but there's nothing that she can do to, one, save some of this dialogue, and two, shake off the feeling that this plot development just feels forced. And okay, I've put it off long enough. Let's talk about the one thing that everyone mocks this film for, and that would be Marwan Kenzari's portrayal as Jafar. Oh my gosh, was he horrifically miscast. Look, I feel bad for the guy, because I'm sure he was doing what he was told, and he's probably heard it over and over again that his performance in this was awful. But yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. Marwan Kenzari just is not even the least bit threatening or intimidating or even entertaining. It's like he's trying as hard as he can to be slimy, but he does it to the point where it's overkill. Like, he's not authentically nasty or slimy. You're always aware that you're watching a performance of someone pretending to be a villain. It's actually kind of embarrassing. So yeah, as you can tell, this film has a lot of problems. And none of them are bad enough that would cause the film to completely sink. But when there's just so many of them and there aren't enough good moments to lift the film up, the problems do start to weigh the film down. Was there anything I liked? Well, I did like this film's version of Friend Like Me. It's actually not a bad cover. Like I said, Will Smith is actually good here and occasionally gets a funny line, and I did like some of the sets. I mean, aesthetically, this film looks just fine. I mean, as much of an issue I have with Guy Ritchie as a director, he at least knows how to make a film look visually interesting. But honestly, that's about it. I wanted to like this movie. I was really hoping that it would be something special, but sadly, it dropped the ball. I'm going to give Aladdin a 4 out of 10. It has some good moments and some good elements, but it's completely overshadowed by the mediocre and bad elements. Add on top of that a film that you know could have been better, could have been improved upon, and for them to miss the mark on so many levels, and you just wind up with a film that's a genuine disappointment. The Lion King 2019. Oh boy, let's just get this one over with. Okay. So I know a lot of people like to say that the Disney live action remakes are basically just carbon copies of the original films that they're based on. And more often than not, that's not the case. However, you can't say that about this one. This one is a carbon copy of the original film, just with a few superficial changes. Oh my word, this is one of the most creatively bankrupt, soulless, so obviously not giving a crap film that Disney has ever put out. Now, that's not to say that Disney hasn't put out worse films, but in terms of just not caring because they know it's going to make money, this is the crowning achievement of suckage. First of all, let's get the elephant, if you'll excuse the pun, in the room out of the way. Does this film count as a live action remake? I mean, yeah, Disney likes to say that this is a live action film, but that's technically a lie. There's only one live action shot in the entire film, and it's the very first one. The rest of the film's completely animated, from the animals to the backgrounds to the objects. It's all animated. So, yeah, technically I shouldn't even be talking about it in this video, because it's not really a Disney live action remake, even though every list talking about the Disney live action remakes includes this film. So why did I even rewatch it? I don't know. But since I did, I might as well talk about it here. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about the animation. I'm mixed on it. On the one hand, this film tries its hardest to make it look like what you're looking at is really live action. And yeah, there are times when it really succeeds. The backgrounds look very realistic, and I'll admit, when I first saw the film, I was so sure that most of the shots were actually live action, just with CG animals on top of it, like they did with Dinosaur. But, to be perfectly honest, the film doesn't really look all that appealing. When I think back on this film, I think about how dull it looks. The colors just look so muted and gray, and it's just not that much fun to look at, especially when you compare it to the gorgeous, bright, vibrant original film. Sure, the film, for the most part, looks like it's really there, but I wish the filmmakers had been allowed a little bit more freedom at stylization. The Jungle Book 2016 had backgrounds that looked both realistic and were gorgeous to look at, so I know it can be done. Another problem with the animation comes from the animals. Now, when an animal doesn't have to talk or attempt emoting or anything like that, it actually looks just fine. But here's the problem. For the animals that do talk, their mouths move. So right away, it's going to look really fake and off, especially when the model is designed to look as realistic as possible. This film tries so hard to make the animals look as much like real animals as possible, and that's fine for the background animals that have no lines, but doing so on the main characters was such a disastrous miscalculation I cannot quantify it. Their faces are so rigid that they're not given the freedom to move or emote. Almost like the animators are afraid that they'll break the models if they move them too much. The result being that most of the time, the main characters just look like they're staring off into space with a dead look in their eyes, almost like they're ventriloquist puppets. And it doesn't help that the voice acting, for the most part, pales in comparison to the original film. Chiwetel Ejiofor completely removes the playful vibe of Jeremy Irons' portrayal of Scar. John Oliver as Zazu doesn't feel like he's even trying to give a good performance, and every joke he tells falls flat. Eric Andre and Keegan Michael Key are unfunny replacements for Benzai and Ed. Again, every joke they tell falls flat. Penny Johnson's alright as Shenzi, but she doesn't leave much of an impression. Whoopi Goldberg's portrayal had a lot more character and personality. This one's just kind of a bland, generic villain leader. The only voice actor returning from the original film was James Earl Jones as Mufasa. And as much as I love James Earl Jones and love his portrayal of Mufasa, I think that bringing him back was a mistake. More than half of his dialogue is just him repeating lines that he said in the original film verbatim. Only this time he sounds much older and far more disinterested. And when you can so easily compare the two performances, and one of them sounds much more alive and full of energy compared to the other, it's a constant distraction. And that's the perfect way to describe this film. It's like the first film, but a lesser version of it. And it doesn't help that every change they do make actively makes the story weaker or doesn't really change anything at all. Most of the changes simply amount to making scenes go on way longer than they did in the original film, like the mouse that Scar catches in the original film. Rather than focusing on him for 7 seconds before he's captured, the film focuses on him for almost 2 minutes. Why? Or how about the scene where a tuft of Simba's fur flies off and makes its way back to Rafiki? The journey on screen lasted for, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds in the original, but in the remake, we get to see every single step of its journey, including, but not limited to, being covered in a ball of giraffe dung. And the journey goes on and on for something like 3 minutes. I swear, it's like this film is actively trying to make fans of the original film angry. This film is similar to both Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin in that it takes what was already a perfectly paced story but adds so much extraneous stuff that it feels like it goes on and on. But then during scenes that try to recreate the original line for line, the pacing just feels off, like they're trying to rush through it as quickly as possible. As if even the film knows that it's wasting your time by recreating those scenes, so it's just trying to get it over with, like ripping off a band-aid. The pacing for this film is just atrocious. Give the film a little credit, though. At least this film made me appreciate the genius of the original film all the more. It made me appreciate the bright colors, the incredible pacing, the timing, the grand scale, just everything that made the original film so special. So that's one positive to come out of the film. But as an actual product in and of itself, this is a waste. I can't even work up the vigor to say that this is a disappointment because that would imply that this film has potential. It's not even the case of something like Beauty and the Beast where there have been other film adaptations and it's based on an older story, so there are other avenues that they could have taken to tell it. With this, I'm not sure what you could have done to fix it or make it worth watching. The only thing that I can think of is if they decided to make it so that the animals don't talk, like they did with 101 Dalmatians or the 1994 Jungle Book. But that would require a lot of work and a lot of rewriting and force them to take risks. And they wanted to crap out a script as quickly as possible. Because I'm not kidding when I say this film feels like someone took the script to the original Lion King, ripped out a handful of random pages, and then very hastily wrote in some obviously inferior in-between lines to fill in the gaps. This script is lazy. As an example of how little this film cares, the song Can You Feel the Love Tonight is sung in the middle of the afternoon as opposed to dusk and night. You know, like the title of the song is supposed to indicate. And if the film can't even be bothered to be invested enough to pay attention to details like that, how the heck is the audience supposed to be invested in the story they're telling? And to an extent, I hate being too harsh on this film, because I know that the animators and special effects artists worked really, really hard on it. I mean, it could not have been easy to make sure all the textures and everything looked so great. I mean, there are some shots in this film that really do look like they are 100% real, and very rarely does a background look fake. Technically speaking, this film is a marvel, or at least parts of it are, but creatively speaking, this film is just so dead. I get zero emotion out of these versions of the characters, because not even the film acts like it cares. And I haven't even touched how this film completely butchered the song Be Prepared, the best song in the original film, and the absolutely heart-pounding stampede scene from the original film. Is there anything good about this film besides the visual effects, or the backgrounds at least? Well, Timon and Pumbaa do occasionally get a legit laugh from time to time, and I think that may be because Billy Eichner and Seth Rogen were given the opportunity to improvise, while the other members of the cast weren't. I especially like the scene where they distract the hyenas, only this time around instead of doing the hula, they do a shout out to Be Our Guest. That moment actually made me laugh. Aside from that, there's nothing else here. I'm gonna give The Lion King a 3 out of 10. You can feel the Disney Corporation's paw hovering over every single frame. This isn't a remake of The Lion King, it's a soulless husk of the original Lion King, and there is no reason to watch this when the original film exists. Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. That's right, they actually made a sequel to the original 2014 Maleficent film. Because I remember thinking to myself, yeah, this is a story that definitely needs to be continued. Okay, let's be fair to this film for a second. As pointless as this movie is, I have to admit, it's not nearly as bad as the original film. Whereas the original film was just kind of dumb and standard, and in some instances actually insulting to the animated film, this one is mostly boring with just one major exception. The climax for this film is freaking insane. This film ends with like a gigantic battle sequences and characters die, and I mean a lot of characters. There are even some well-established characters that get the axe. It's actually kind of engaging and interesting, even if for no other reason than you just can't believe that this is how the story turns out. There's literally a scene that takes place in a church where the doors are locked and an organ is spewing a deadly gas out of his pipes that is killing the trapped people inside without mercy. It looks like something straight out of a Holocaust film. I am not kidding. It also doesn't help that this film makes it very clear that the villain was inspired by Hitler, rhetoric-wise at least, so yeah, the comparison is kind of unavoidable. So, does this ending make the entire film worth watching? Not really. Like I said before, everything that comes before the climax is really boring. This film is about Maleficent trying to discover where she truly belongs as she comes across her own species again, which, okay, maybe there's something interesting that you can do with that, but they really don't. It's mostly just her watching from the sidelines as two different factions argue over whether or not they should go to war with the humans, and yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, Maleficent doesn't really do that much in this film. She's mostly just pushed off to the side. And it's like in Dumbo, in that she's more or less relegated to a supporting role in her own movie. And yeah, this movie is 2 hours long, and brother does it feel like it. Especially so in the second act, as you can feel every second scrape by. Up until you get to the climax, there's not really anything to keep your interest. The human characters are so boring. They somehow found an even blander actor to play Prince Philip this time. And Elle Fanning is trying. I mean, she is really trying as Aurora, but she's given nothing to work with. The villain, on top of being incredibly obvious, is also really boring. The motivations aren't really made clear, and there's nothing really that much fun about her. Like I said before, she's basically just Hitler, just with the burning hatred for fairies, that, as far as I can recall, was never really explained. That's just not interesting. She feels like a villain that only exists because, well, the story needs a villain. And that's my issue with this film. If you're going to make a sequel to a film that, in all honesty, probably shouldn't have existed in and of itself, you need to make sure that you have a really great story that needs to be told, or some brand new angle that you can look at the story, or a new spin to it, or something. This one kinda starts to have okay ideas, like Maleficent finding her own kind, trying to find acceptance there, and maybe you could dive into how the politics of a world like this would operate. Maybe that could be interesting. I think most kids would find that really boring, but it would at least be a new angle to approach the story. But it feels like this film didn't really know what it wanted to do. Like, even the film itself knows that it doesn't really have a need to exist. And you can notice that in the film's absolutely staggering tonal shifts. There are moments in this film where it takes itself a bit too seriously. I was actually kind of surprised that this movie got away with a PG rating because it has some really dark moments in it. And then by the end, when the fighting has stopped and they decided they're going to bridge the kingdoms, and everyone's all smiles and celebrating this beautiful wedding, and hey, remember all those hundreds upon hundreds of people that died like literally less than an hour ago? Don't you think that maybe you should, I don't know, bury the dead, give people time to grieve, or have like a national mourning period or something, instead of just going on with this wedding like a mass slaughter didn't just occur earlier that day? The tone for this film is just kind of all over the place. This kind of everybody's happy and laughing happy ending does not mesh with the incredibly dark sequences of attempted mass genocide and characters dying by the bucket loads. And not to give anything away, but the final comeuppance for the main villain is just so weak. It's basically treated just like a giant joke when, no, somebody this vile and evil deserves a fate worse than death. This film is like 2 or 3 different completely inconsistent movies fighting to reach the surface, and none of them completely work. Thus, there is no coherent vision. But I'll admit, I've never seen a film like this. It's unique. It's not good, not even close, but at least it's unique. At least this film didn't make me angry, so hooray for small blessings, I guess. I'm gonna give Maleficent Mistress of Evil a 5 out of 10. Like I said, this wasn't the most infuriating thing I've ever sat through, and the climax almost made it worth it, but overall, it's long, boring, and a chore to get through. I'll be honest, I had actually never seen the Lady and the Tramp remake before I started undergoing this project. I just never got around to it. But now I have no excuse not to have seen it. So I sat down, flipped on Disney Plus, watched it, and it's definitely a movie. It's a movie that exists. Out of all the Disney live action remakes, this is the one that I am the most apathetic towards. It didn't leave me feeling angry, it didn't leave me feeling annoyed, and it didn't leave me feeling fulfilled either. It basically killed about 98 minutes of my time in a painless but unmemorable way. This is basically the same movie as the first, just with the beaver completely removed and Aunt Sarah's Siamese cats replaced with a new breed of cat, and they sing a completely different, inferior song, which sounds weirdly similar to the Gilligan's Island theme for some reason. There's a few other differences, but not much, or at least none really worth bringing up. So I guess the only thing to really talk about is the effects of the dogs. Short answer, there are times when they look really real, and there are times when they look really fake. They don't look quite as dead-eyed and soulless as in The Lion King, but they don't look as expressive as the ones in the Jungle Book. And honestly, considering this film didn't even go to theaters, I'm not gonna complain too much about the effects. That being said, there are scenes or aspects of this film that are just so weird now that they're in live action. For instance, there's a dog catcher that is so insistent on catching Tramp, and he treats it like he's Inspector Javert or U.S. Marshal Gerard or Captain Ahab, and Tramp is this highly elusive old foe of his. And yeah, something like that could work in animation, but this peels off in live action. Same thing with the famous spaghetti scene. Yeah, in animation, you can buy that these 2 waiters would serve 2 dogs a plate of spaghetti, but in live action, even for a fantasy, it feels too far-fetched. But honestly, Lady and the Tramp's biggest issue is that it's dull. The original film did have charm and personality to make it work. It wasn't perfect, but it was a soft, pleasant little animated romance. This entire film just feels like it's on autopilot. The other remakes kind of had that to an extent, but this one especially just feels like that throughout the majority of the film. The only time where I was actually invested in what was going on was the climax. That 10-minute sequence was actually done really well. In that moment, the film suddenly clicked and it seemed like it was invested. But aside from that, there's not much here. I know I said before that Dumbo was the most pointless out of all the Disney live-action remakes, but now that I've actually seen this, I'm honestly not sure. Out of all the remakes, this one is by far the least talked about, and I can see why. It's not really bad enough to rip apart, but it's not good enough to go out of your way to see it either. It just kind of exists. It came and went, and now nobody talks about it. It's basically already been forgotten. and it's barely a year old. Honestly, I don't even know what else to say about it. This is the definition of a middling film. I'm going to give this film a 5 out of 10. It's watchable and passable, but overall, it's forgettable. Alright, before we get into the final review, I want to address something serious first. Otherwise, it's going to be in the back of a lot of people's mind if I don't. I know that there are a lot of controversies surrounding this film. And it's not about the content of the film itself, but rather it's about stuff that crosses over into the realm of real world politics. Some of it kinda dirty and uncomfortable. So I want to make my stance on this very clear. I am judging this film based solely on the content of the film itself, not based on anything the company making it did, or anything any of the cast or crew may have said or done, past, present, or future. The circumstances in which it was made and all the related controversies played zero role in my determination as to whether or not I think it's a good film. When I review a film, I try my best to separate the real world from the film as a piece of art when I review it in as unbiased a manner as I possibly can. Even if I think someone is an absolutely disgusting piece of human filth, if they performed well in a film, or shot a film well, or wrote a fantastic screenplay, I will try to give credit where credit is due. But because films don't exist in a vacuum and because I'm only human, or sometimes even because of extenuating circumstances, that's just not possible, but I do try. Alright, that was unpleasant. Let's get into the actual review. Mulan 2020. I just got through watching this last month, and by golly, I was not looking forward to revisiting it. But I figured I made it this far. I might as well finish what I started. And I thought, maybe there was more to it that I missed the first time around. Maybe there was a hidden layer or subtleties that I didn't catch the first time. Well, after watching it again, I can definitively say that no, that's not the case. Great flaming piles of balderdash is this film awful. There is just so much wrong with this movie that I don't have the time, nor even really the energy to go over it all. There are plenty of videos on YouTube right now that go into great detail as to why this film is such a disaster, and I'm sure many of you have already seen at least one of them. So if you want more details, you can check some of those out. For now, I'll just go over the highlights, so to speak. When I originally reviewed the animated Mulan, I said that it was a really good film, but not one of Disney's greatest. But after seeing this film, I might have to reconsider that opinion. Much like the Lion King remake, this film made me appreciate even more the nuance, the character, the subtleties, the craftsmanship of the original film. In the original animated Mulan, we saw the struggles of the characters, particularly Mulan. She was very much out of her depth, but worked and eventually proved herself. Let me tell you, sometimes you don't understand how great a character is until you see them completely butchered. And yeah, let's talk about the number one problem with this film. Mulan. The way she's acted, the way she's written, and her character arc. Nothing about this character works. This film, for some reason, decided to make her an already powerful warrior who is infused with chi pretty much from birth. Now, I am no expert on the concept of chi or Chinese culture, so I will leave that to people who actually know what they're talking about. What I want to focus on is how this affects Mulan's character arc. To put it bluntly, she's basically a superhero. In fact, the backstory of hers and her journey feels incredibly similar to Captain Marvel. She starts off already strong. Everyone around her is just telling her to hide or suppress it. She does it first, but then she decides she's not going to, and then she becomes a powerful warrior. More so than she already was. In this version of the story, because Mulan is already a powerful fighter, she's never really in any physical danger, and there's really nothing for her to learn. It also makes her sacrifice of taking her father's place feel much less impactful. It feels like it's much less of a sacrifice since she's not really out of her depth the same way the original Mulan was. So the weight of her choice is completely absent in this remake. So already this film is at a huge disadvantage compared to the animated version, because the character arc for the titular protagonist is much weaker. This film is also internally inconsistent, especially with regards to the message it's trying to tell. So, the whole message of the film is that you should never hide who you are. Ever. under any circumstances. Okay, this message of be yourself has been done to death, not just in other films, but by Disney. But its inclusion in this story is especially baffling for one simple reason. Mulan would have never gotten as far as she did if she hadn't pretended to be male. I mean, what if she had decided to just be herself from the beginning? Best case scenario, she gets sent home dishonored. Worst case scenario, she's executed. And that's the point. This whole be yourself mentality is incredibly infantile within its thinking within the context of this story, which is ironic for a film that seems to want to tell a more, quote, mature version of the story. This story does not match the message it's trying to tell. And at one point, Mulan is saved from a projectile from the binding that she was using to hold her breast down to, pretend that she's a man. And the message that she takes away from that is that it was wrong to ever pretend to be a man. I'm sorry, what? How does that make any sense? And then she just runs into battle, sans armor, and with her long flowing hair completely uncovered. So I guess being practical on the battlefield, that means you're not being true to yourself or something. I don't know. Not to mention, the film script makes everything easy for Mulan. And I'm not even just talking about her superpowers, which gives her the ability to wipe up enemies like they're nothing. I'm talking about how she's basically being guided through the plot by the hand. Some kind of obstacle comes up that could expose her secret, she's immediately given an out. She doesn't know where to go and what to do next. A character comes out of nowhere and tells her what she needs to do next. Because of this, there's never any sense of accomplishment for the character. Everything just kind of magically works out for her. She's like Domino in Deadpool 2, only minus the fun personality. I am not kidding when I say that this film plays out like a self-insert wish fulfillment fanfiction of the original Mulan, except with a $200 million price tag. It is that pandering, that lazy, and that pathetic. Any subtlety the original film had is completely stripped away. This film wants you to understand that almost all the male characters and some of the female characters are misogynist, as one would expect in this patriarchal society. And so they're so terrified that you might not get it, that they beat you over the head with it to the point where it becomes laughable. This movie feels like it's written for little kids. There's nothing adult about the way the story is written, or the message, or anything. The original animated film was more adult than this PG-13 war film. Also, as a side note, there is no reason for this to be rated PG-13 at all. This is one of the lamest, tamest PG-13s I've ever seen in my life. The original Lion King was more intense than this film, and that film was rated G. Some of the action would probably be at least some decent eye candy if the terrible editing didn't constantly distract from it. There are moments in this film where the editing is so awful and the cuts are made so quickly and so frequently that it makes your eyes sting. All the performances in this film range from awful or just bland and forgettable. There is not a single good performance here. The actress playing Mulan, Ye-Fei Liu, is so flat that it's impossible to connect with her character. Jason Scott Lee, Mowgli from the 1994 Jungle Book from the beginning of this video, is so dull that he leaves no impression, and will leave you pining for the likes of Shan Yu, who was already one of Disney's weaker antagonists. Rosalind Chow plays a witch who wants to fit in society, so she teams up with the bad guy who declares that she will be accepted by society. Somehow, it's honestly not really explained, but then she gets so inspired seeing Mulan leading men into battle that she switches sides and sacrifices herself to save Mulan, which I guess makes up for the crap ton of soldiers that she slaughtered in battle previous. Yeah, much like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, she has a sad backstory, so I guess that automatically means you're supposed to feel sorry for her despite all the horrible things that she did, and no, I'm not going to feel sorry for this character. There's also a bland love interest who is so boring that I didn't even bother to look up who played him because he left so little of an impact. Most of the soldiers are forgettable and don't form any sense of camaraderie either with each other or with Mulan. The family is just a pale imitation compared to the original, and Jet Li is wasted as the Emperor. The film's plot and story structure is sloppy. There is nothing resembling plot progression in this film. Things just happen as the plot demands. Absolutely nothing flows together smoothly and nothing feels at stake. This is not helped by the fact that the actors are so bad that they never feel like, one, they're invested, and two, they're genuinely worried about anything. I know I sound like I'm rambling and jumping all over the place, but that's the problem. There is just so much garbage in this film to talk about that it's difficult to stay focused. Okay, positives. What were some of the positives of this film? Well, I like the production design for the most part. The cinematography is alright. The sets and costume work are really good. Some of the action is alright, again, when the atrocious editing allows you to see it. And I did like some of the instrumentals. That's about it. This film is so bad that it almost becomes fascinating in how terrible it is, both as a remake and as a story in its own right, which does provide at least something resembling a modicum of intrigue. But that's not high praise. This movie sucks. It really sucks. I'm gonna give Mulan a 3 out of 10, and it barely escaped a 2. And the saddest irony is, despite the fact that the original Mulan is such a great film, this is a remake that had potential. It could have worked. There have been other versions of Mulan, even other live-action retellings of Mulan. But somehow this grown-up version seems more childish and less serious than the animated film. The fact that Disney originally charged people $30 just to rent this steaming pile of garbage on their streaming service is an insult. And that was it. As of the making of this video, that's the last Disney live-action remake. Cruella is the next one currently scheduled to be released in May of this year, although we'll see how that goes. I don't have high hopes for the film, but whatever, I'm willing to give it a chance. Alright, so here's the breakdown of the films released so far. Out of the 17 films, 5 were good, 2 were passable, 5 were mediocre, and 5 were bad. That leads to 7 that I think are worth watching and 10 that I think are not. So, yeah, there are more bad Disney live-action remakes than there are good ones. I don't think that's going to come across as a big surprise to anyone. Did watching these in order cause me to see any patterns? Sort of. I got the feeling that the longer this trend continues, the worse the films tended to get. Like they stopped caring about the stories. I don't know if it's because Disney was just cranking these out so quickly that they weren't given enough time to work out all the kinks, or if they hired people who just didn't care, but for whatever reason, the soul of the films tended to diminish as they continued. Watching something like the Lion King remake or the Mulan remake, and then looking back on something like 101 Dalmatians shows quite the difference. By the end of the marathon, I was drained. I had to take a break in the middle and watch the original Lion King just to remind myself of how great this company can, or rather used to be. And yeah, there hasn't been a good Disney live-action remake since Christopher Robin. 2019 had 5 and all of them were bad. And while it's certainly possible that every once in a while they'll make a good remake, I still think we're going to get more bad ones than good ones. Now, let's get down to the big question. What do I think about the idea of Disney doing live-action remakes in general? Well, I'm certainly not against the idea in principle. I mean, like I said, there are good Disney live-action remakes out there. I just wish they would pick movies in which there were areas that they could improve upon. Pete's Dragon was an example of that, so was The Jungle Book. There are plenty of Disney films that could benefit from an update. Some of them even have source materials they could derive more material from. The Black Cauldron, Atlantis the Lost Empire, Pocahontas, Sword in the Stone, Hunchback of Notre Dame. As long as they put in the effort, they'd have the potential to not only be good, but great. But even if they're going to remake movies that are already perfectly fine or as close to perfect as it can, Disney has shown they can pull that off too. 101 Dalmatians was an example of that. Sure, it's not better than the animated film, but it is still a really good and entertaining film. But doing that requires a lot of time and effort, and most importantly, passion in order for it to work. And I know the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you're forced to make a remake out of these perfect classics, then you must resist the urge to copy too much. The 3 biggest offenders of copying way too much were Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and especially The Lion King. But just because you deviate from the material, that also doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a good film. As both Dumbo and Mulan prove, you actually need to replace the material with something good and worth watching. And given that Disney is in a lot of financial trouble right now, and before the pandemic, most of these remakes made a lot of money, do not expect them to slow down making them. And from a business perspective, I get it. I mean, sure, the Lion King remake is a shallow, soulless husk of the original film. But it became the highest grossing animated film of all time when it was released. I just wish they could also make good products and hide the fact that they're obvious cash grabs just a little bit more. And now, here's my ranking of all 17 of the Disney live-action remakes to date from the worst to the best. Number 17, the worst Disney live-action remake is Alice Through the Looking Glass. Number 16 is Mulan. Number 15 is The Lion King. Number 14 is Maleficent. Number 13 is Aladdin. Number 12 is Dumbo. Number 11 is Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. Number 10 is The Jungle Book 1994. Number 9 is Lady and the Tramp. Number 8 is Alice in Wonderland. Number 7 is Beauty and the Beast. Number 6 is 102 Dalmatians. Number 5 is 101 Dalmatians. Number 4 is Cinderella. Number 3 is The Jungle Book. Number 2 is Pete's Dragon. And number 1, the best Disney live-action remake to date is Christopher Robin. And yeah, I guess that's it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have an idea for another one of these long-form review videos, feel free to let me know in the comment section down below. And be sure to subscribe to be updated when the next one's released, or any other videos I happen to make in between. Again, thank you so much for watching. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.